So just how close are we to having 40 cars on this year's Indianapolis 500 entry list? Well, at the beginning of November, I have the car count set at 38. Now, there's certainly the potential that we could have a couple surprise entries, as we usually seem to do for the Indianapolis 500. Keep in mind that in the last couple years, we had no idea at this point in the year that Fernando Alonso or Danica Patrick were going to do the Indy 500 in their respective years. Now, the 38 car number is not based on any particular speculation on my part. Now, there will be speculation in this video, and that will be on who could possibly fill vacant seats. But the 38 car number itself has been reported on by the various journalists in the motorsport community that these teams are moving and shaking, trying to get these cars ready for either a full season, a partial season, or the Indianapolis 500 itself. So that 38 car number, I'm pretty confident in reporting to you at this particular moment. But the fun part, of course, is wondering who might drive in those cars, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, what we won't be necessarily talking about is some of the high-profile stars, quote-unquote, that may or may not be there, and that includes Fernando Alonso, by the way, but it also means I'm not going to be placing Tony Stewart or Casey Kane in a car anytime soon, though there's a possibility that they could be in an Indy 500 somewhere down the line in the relative near future. It also is worth noting that each car over the 33 car grid threshold means another car bumped from the field, meaning a potential big name might miss the show like James Hinchcliffe did last year. It's been made very clear by IndyCar and IMS that there will only be 33 cars in the Indianapolis 500, and the reason we get so excited about this entry list every year is because if there's more than 33 cars, that means it's going to be one hell of an exciting month trying to figure out exactly who the fastest 33 are. So speaking of that, let's find out who are going to be vying for those 33 spots. Let's get to talking about the current look at the 38 entries for the Indy 500. So appropriately, we start talking about the 2019 Indy 500 by talking about the 2018 champions, Team Penske. Of course, the three full-season drivers, Joseph Newgarden, Will Power, and Simon Pagenaud, will be a part of the team, and as well as Helio Castroneves, the three-time Indianapolis 500 winner, now a full-time IMSA driver, but of course, they want to keep him on that Indy 500 squad because they want to see if they can get a fourth Indy 500 win with Helio Castroneves. Now, there is a bit of a question about Penske Racing and the potential, or at least the Verizon sponsorship. We did see Will Power test recently without any major Verizon logos on his car. There could be a bit of a question whether or not that sponsorship will stay around, and Helio Castroneves himself seems to be sticking with Pennzoil sponsorship for next year, which is interesting because the Shell Pennzoil branding on his car has flip-flopped each year, but there was a die-cast pre-order which claimed to be a 2019 Helio Castroneves Pennzoil car. So I guess the Yellow Submarine is sticking around for yet another year. Next up is AJ Foyt Racing, which had a bit of a resurgence last year with Tony Kanaan. They led a pretty big portion of the race, and it seemed like Kanaan had one of the better cars in the race. He was kind of hampered by a rear tire failure and then had a crash late in the race, which kind of took them out of contention. I expect to see the same three cars that we saw last year. Of course, Matthias Leist, Tony Kanaan, those are the two major drivers for the team, the full season drivers anyway. And then the third car, now last year it was a collaboration between Jonathan Bird, or the Jonathan Bird group, the two sons of Jonathan Bird, as well as Hollinger and Belardi. It's unclear if that partnership will continue, but it was interesting because AJ Foyt Racing, up until the early part of last year, were adamant that they would not do a third car this year or last year in the Indy 500, and then suddenly they had a third car. It seems like Foyt always does a third car, and that wouldn't really surprise me if there is a third car this year. You would expect that if it is the Bird collaboration once again, that James Davison would have the seat. The Birds seem to like him. Davison's usually pretty fast at Indianapolis, though he does seem to have a lot of crashes, as we have seen in recent years. Anybody else who could possibly take that seat, I'm not particularly sure, but sometimes Foyt pulls a rabbit out of their hat, so to speak. Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports had a pretty up and down month of May, of course, with James Hinchcliffe missing the show. And of course, Hinchcliffe will be back next year. He'll be paired with rookie Marcus Ericsson, who of course takes the place of the injured Robert Wickens. And then of course we have the third car on the team, which is usually entered by Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports. I expect it to be entered this year again. Now, what's interesting is that who potentially could take that seat. Of course, Jay Howard has driven it the last couple of years. He always seems to come up with a budget, at least in recent years, to be able to do that. A lot of that has to do with the fact that he has a collaboration with Tony Stewart. Could that continue? Possibly. We could also see drivers like Carlos Munoz, who had a brief association with Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports last year, filling in for Robert Wickens in the 6th car. We could also see a guy like Oriol Servia, who's currently on the outs with Scuderia Corsa since they went to Ed Carpenter Racing. And of course, Servia drove for them in the 2016 Indianapolis 500. So there are a few possibilities for that third seat. We'll just have to wait and see exactly how that plays out. And we go on to another team which is set in stone. The Harding Steinbrenner Racing Team. This team almost became McLaren in the offseason, but it was the Steinbrenner family of Yankee baseball fame that stepped up to the plate, so to speak. That's a good pun. Pato O'Ward and Colton Herta will be doing the driving duties. They were first and second in the Indy Lights Championship last year, and I think they were first and second in the Freedom 100 this year. So those two drivers definitely know how to get around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, though it'll be interesting to see how they operate on a two-rookie team. Now, certainly, they're going to have Andretti Autosport help in terms of their chassis setup, but what's interesting is that they will have Chevy engines, and the Chevy engines seem to be a little bit more powerful. At least they were a little bit better this year at the Indianapolis 500. It remains to be seen if that trend continues, but you'd expect with the package being virtually the same as it was last year that the Chevys are going to be strong. So Ganassi Racing sticks with their two-car lineup. Of course, Scott Dixon, the IndyCar champion, as well as the 2008 Indy 500 champion, will be leading the team, along with Felix Rosenqvist from Sweden. It's hard to say his name without getting a little bit tongue-tied, but I tried. And Ganassi Racing is interesting because it's a two-car effort, and it's certainly one that we've seen in the past expand to 4 cars. So certainly if there was a celebrity entry, so to speak, I think the place that they would want to go is Ganassi, because certainly Ganassi has the manpower and the capability in terms of chassis that they own to be able to expand to an extra or maybe 2 extra cars. Would they do it? It's hard to say. They certainly didn't do it last year, though they were looking at bringing in Danica Patrick to the team. They just couldn't make that deal work. So at the moment, it's going to be Dixon along with Rosenqvist, and certainly I think Felix is the guy everybody's going to be thinking is going to be the top contender for Rookie of the Year. So Carlin Racing, this is a fairly interesting one because, of course, there's a lot of things up in the air about Carlin Racing, but one of the things that they seem to be working very hard on is bringing in 3 cars for next season, and you would have to imagine that there'll be 3 funded drivers. The only driver we really have confirmed is Max Chilton, of course, because his father is a pretty major shareholder in Carlin Racing, and of course, Max brings a lot of funding into that team. So Chilton for sure on the team, but we have 2 TBAs. Now, who could go into those seats? Well, we know R.C. Anderson has been testing with Carlin Racing. You would think that if the check clears, he may be a full season contender for that team. There's a potential that Charlie Kimball could keep his seat at Carlin Racing or at least run a partial schedule with that team. Apparently, he has half a budget or half a full season's budget. There's also the potential we could see some drivers like Zachary Clayman DeMello or Santi Urrutia take that seat because, of course, they had some funding and now it seems like they may be on the outs at COYNE. It just depends. So next we move on to Rahal, Letterman, Lanigan Racing. Of course, usually a 3-car effort at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and actually they've been looking at expanding to a 3rd full-time car for next season, though the rumor mill seems to have gone a bit quiet on that. Of course, Graham Rahal and 2017 Indy 500 winner Takuma Sato will be leading the charge for that team. You'd think that Oriol Servia would be the top candidate to fill that 3rd seat. Of course, he's been with the team quite a few times. in the past, but there's also the rumors out there that they were very interested in Colin Braun, who of course drove an IMSA last year to second in the prototype championship. It'd be a bit strange to bring on Colin Braun just for the Indy 500. So that's why I kind of lean toward Serviet taking that seat, though there's a potential that maybe, again, Rahal could surprise us by just pulling a rabbit out of their hat. So next up is Dale Coyne Racing, which I expect to have a 4-car armada like they did last year. Of course, the two ones that I think we can confirm more or less for this team are Sebastian Bourdais. Of course, we already know he's re-signed with the team, as well as Pippa Mann, who always seems to come up with a budget. Despite being bumped last year, I think she's going to be okay. I think she'll be able to put the budget together and run once again for Dale Coyne. And by the way, I think that's the only way Dale Coyne does have 4 cars is if Pippa Mann brings a budget once again to bring the 63 car to the track. Now, the other 2 seats are interesting because there was quite a bit of talk that Santino Ferrucci was going to be in the second Dale Coyne car full season. That talk has kind of simmered down a little bit since there's been a little bit of legal issues going on with Ferrucci and his family. We'll have to see exactly how that all works out. That could potentially put a monkey wrench into things. And of course, the second car, that was run by Connor Daly last year. It'll be a question of, I guess, whether or not Tom Burns can put together the funding once again to bring Daly back to the track. Remember, Eli Lilly was associated, one of the sponsors on that team last year. They're certainly not going to be associated with the Dalys anymore, unfortunately. So that's one thing that could potentially be on the outs for Connor Daly, though I would expect that Connor Daly's probably one of the top drivers that they would be looking at to fill that seat. Of course, Zachary Clayman DeMello is another one you could look at, as well as Pietro Fittipaldi, who was originally scheduled to drive the Indy 500 last year for the team, but of course got injured at Spa and was unable to do that. So there's quite a few drivers that could be looking at Dale Coyne, and of course Dale, you know, being the businessman that he is looking for a big paycheck. It's almost like Carlin Racing. A lot of these teams are going to be looking for drivers with funding, especially for their empty seats. And there do seem to be a lot of drivers with funding out there, so I do expect that these seats are going to be filled. We go on to another team that's pretty much completely confirmed. Ed Carpenter Racing with Scuderia Corsa. Of course, Ed Carpenter finished second last year in the Indianapolis 500 and took the pole position. He probably will be that threat once again. It seems like the Ed Carpenter team has a really good handle on the DW12 chassis with the UAK 18 attached to it. Of course, Spencer Piggott as well. He's on the team for the remainder of next year as well. And we also have the new addition to the team, Ed Jones, who has thrown a life raft by Ed Carpenter, and will be driving the official Scuderia Corsa entry for that team. This is one to watch because Piggott has really improved quite a bit on the oval tracks. Carpenter, of course, is always very fast, and if you give Ed Jones the right equipment, as Dale Coyne did last year, and I guess Ganassi didn't 2 years ago, and then Ganassi didn't do this year, Ed Jones can perform very well on the oval. So I think this particular team is going to be very strong. And then we move on to a team that's not necessarily confirmed, but I don't expect it to change very much. You've got Dreyer and Reinbold Racing. They expanded to 2 cars last year with Sage Karam and JR Hildebrand. I expect that combination to stay the same, especially because Hildebrand did much better in the race than Karam, but Karam was faster overall. Karam is a favorite of Dreyer and Reinbold, as well as the fact that JR Hildebrand was impressing to his sponsor Salesforce last year, and I think Salesforce would like to stay on. They certainly activated quite a bit. You would expect that they would probably stay on, as well as the fact that Hildebrand, of course, got a top 10 in last year's Indianapolis 500 with Dreyer and Reinbold. So I would think that this team will stay the same for next year, a 2-car effort, and it's always fun to have an Indy-only team be as strong as Dreyer and Reinbold usually is. All right, the very juicy Andretti Autosport. We'll talk about the easy ones first, the full season team. Zach Veach, Ryan Hunter-Reay, Alexander Rossi, and Marco Andretti. Now, Marco's team, of course, is a little bit different because it's associated with Brian Herta, I should say, as well as now Marco Andretti has bought into that team. So it's Andretti Autosport Brian Herta Autosport with Andretti Autosport and Curb Agajanian and Marco Andretti. I think that's the full name of that team. But regardless, the 4 core Andretti Autosport cars will remain the same. And then I would expect the 6th and 7th car will be entered as well, cars 29 and 25. You may notice the color of the 29 car. That's intentional, because I think we all expect who's going to be driving that car next year, but there's still no confirmation of who is going to be driving that car next year, so I won't necessarily come out and say it, but it's orange. And then car number 25, that's going to be an interesting one, because if we make the assumption that our Lord and Savior Fernando is going to drive the 29 car, there's a bit of a competition for that 25 car, because you look at the performance that Stefan Wilson put in last year, leading the race late and really putting a hell of a move around the outside of several cars to get the lead in the first place. You'd think that, hey, maybe Andretti Autosport might want to give him a second chance to try to win the 500. And then you also look at Carlos Munoz. That's another guy who I think I've mentioned for several teams at this point. But again, Munoz is one of those guys who is solid at the Indianapolis 500. Andretti Autosport likes him. They like to bring him in. He's always fast. It's going to be tough. And then, of course, there's always the question of maybe Andretti Autosport goes with somebody completely random. That's always a possibility. Who knows? But I really do believe that there's going to be 3 drivers going for those seats. Obviously, Fernando, if he shows up, is pretty much guaranteed that he'll get that seat. But then you look at Stefan Wilson and Carlos Munoz. Who are they going to choose there? I don't know. Let me know, comments. Then we move on to JUNCOS Racing with 2 cars that they are planning on entering for the full season if the funding becomes available. But, and that's pretty interesting, because JUNCOS Racing was not even a full season entrant last year in the IndyCar Series. They were partial season. I guess they're looking at running a full season with at least 1 car next year, possibly 2, if the funding comes to them. And they seem to have a lot of interest from South American drivers, so much so that they've been able to expand into IMSA racing with a Cadillac DPI. So if they're going to have 2 cars, I would expect that the Indianapolis 500 would probably be the place they would do it. Of course, in their very first race in the IndyCar Series, they had 2 cars. They ran one for Spencer Pigot, as well as one for Sebastian Saavedra in 2017. Now, that was kind of necessary because there was a potential that there wasn't even going to be 33 cars. My God, how far have we come in the last couple of years? But it seems like JUNCOS Racing is pretty serious about the prospect of getting up into the upper echelons of the sport, and of course expanding your team past 1 car is a great way to do it. So who could be driving these cars? Well, certainly you would think that Kyle Kaiser would be one of the guys they'd be looking at, specifically because of how well he did developing that car and getting it into the field when it wasn't a guarantee last year. And remember, it was all new stuff to the team and to the driver. So the fact that he was able to find that speed very early on was a very positive direction. I also could see a Charlie Kimball going to this team. It seems like almost a great fit, even if it's a partial season, for a guy like Charlie Kimball to stay in the sport, and certainly he would be a guy that would be able to get that car into the show if it need be. I think another guy, Santi Urrutia, could be a guy you could see coming into this car, because again, the South American roots, and the fact that he's got a big fan base. He had a budget last year. He was looking at going to Harding Racing. Harding Racing told him no at that time. So assuming that he still has that same budget, there's no reason to expect that he wouldn't be able to get into a seat. Then there's the possibility, again, of some of the drivers I've mentioned earlier, like the Zachary Clayman DeMellos of the world. There's a lot of possibilities here, and it'll be interesting to see exactly who JUNCOS goes with closer to the start of the season. And then finally, the 38th entry, MEYER Shank Racing. Not a whole lot to talk about because not a whole lot has changed with Jack Harvey at the wheel. Now, what's interesting about this is that Jack Harvey will have a brand new Dallara chassis to drive next year. MEYER Shank actually invested in a second chassis, but that second chassis is going to be prepared specifically for the Indianapolis 500, which is interesting because, of course, Jack Harvey was running up at the front along with Stefan Wilson last year. Sure, it was on fuel mileage, but I'm sure there was a point in Michael Shank's head where he said, I like this. I like running up front. Let's do it some more. And that seems to be what they're interested in with Jack Harvey. So that was a look at the prospects of a 38 car at the moment entry for the Indianapolis 500. Let me know what you think. Let me know here who might get some of those vacant empty seats. That will be an interesting discussion. Do you think this number is right? Do you think there will be 38 cars? Do you think there'll be less? Do you think there'll be more? If there are more, where do you expect them to come from? Could Buddy Lazier be making a comeback? There's always that possibility. So maybe that's the 39th entry. We'll just have to wait and see. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and we'll see you in the next video.